What if Dr. Eggman and his robots invaded Warhammer 40k? The sky over Armageddon didn't just crack open, it screamed. A wound of impossible colors tore through reality itself, vomiting something massive into the ash-choked atmosphere. Guardsmen on the firing line froze. Orcs stopped mid-charge. Even the servitors paused in their endless mechanical prayers. What descended wasn't a Chaos Hulk. It wasn't a Necron tomb ship. It was a perfect sphere of red and white metal, gleaming like a mechanical god's eye, descending on jets of azure flame that turned the sky into a hellish canvas of light and shadow. The sphere was massive, titan-sized. It rotated slowly as it descended, panels opening like the petals of a steel flower, revealing bay after bay of machinery that hummed with power signatures the Imperium's Auspex arrays couldn't classify. Tech priests monitoring the orbital arrays went into seizures of binary panic. This wasn't warp-touch technology, it wasn't Xenos, it was something else entirely, something that made their cogitators weep with data they couldn't process. One thing was certain to every soul who witnessed that descent. Whatever had arrived on Armageddon 7, it had not come in peace. Inside that sphere sat a man who had no idea he'd just entered hell. Dr. Ivo Robotnik, known to his enemies as Eggman, leaned back in his command throne with a grin splitting his mustached face. His scanners showed primitive industrial settlements below, crude ballistic weapons, steam-powered machinery that belonged in a museum. He'd been trying to open a portal to another dimension where Sonic couldn't follow him, where he could finally build his empire in peace. Instead, he'd found what looked like a medieval civilization playing with gunpowder. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. This would be easier than he'd ever imagined. Orbit Qubit, begin atmospheric analysis, Eggman commanded, adjusting his goggles as holographic displays bloomed around him. The readings were fascinating. Radiation levels that should kill organic life, atmospheric toxins that made his pollution look like fresh air, strange energy signatures his instruments labeled simply as error. No matter, he'd conquered stranger worlds, he'd built empires from nothing. These primitive warlords with their crude guns and silly Gothic architecture would bow to his genius within a week. 2 weeks maximum. He was already designing the statue they'd build of him in their largest city. What Eggman didn't see were the kill orders already being transmitted across the Imperium. Inquisitor Krakarov of the Ordo Hereticus watched the sphere's descent from orbit and made his judgment in 3 seconds. Unlicensed artificial intelligence, unsanctioned technology, probable demon engine contamination. Exterminatus protocols were being prepared before Eggman's landing gear even touched the ash. The Adeptus Mechanicus were having theological meltdowns. This technology operated on principles that violated the sacred patterns. It had to be destroyed, or captured, or worshipped. They couldn't decide which, and that indecision would cost them everything. On the ground, Sergeant Varkas of the Armageddon Steel Legion watched through magnoculars as the sphere touched down 15 kilometers from his position. The impact cratered the earth. Dust rose like a mushroom cloud. And then the machines came, hundreds of them, thousands. Sleek hovering drones with glowing optics, bipedal robots wielding energy weapons, spider-like constructors that immediately began burrowing into the earth, extracting resources with efficiency that made Imperial mining equipment look like children's toys. They moved with purpose, with coordination, without hesitation or prayer or ritual. It was obscene, it was beautiful, it was terrifying. "What in the Emperor's name?" Varkas whispered. His vox speed crackled with panicked reports from every regiment on the continent. The machines were spreading, building, conquering territory not through war, but through presence. They simply arrived and began reshaping reality around them. Forests were consumed, mountains were carved, rivers were redirected. All within the first hour, the Imperium had faced Necrons, Tyranids, chaos itself. But they'd never faced something like this, something so coldly, efficiently, horrifyingly productive. If you want to witness the greatest clash of science and grimdark the galaxy has ever seen, then hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because what happens next will redefine what it means to invade the Imperium of Man. Dr. Eggman thinks he's found paradise. The Imperium thinks it's found another heretic to burn. They're both wrong. What's about to unfold will make the Horus heresy look like a minor disagreement. This is the story of what happens when cartoon villainy meets cosmic horror, when unstoppable ambition collides with an immovable nightmare. Let's begin. Eggman's first mistake was assuming the Imperium was stupid. His second was thinking he understood their technology. His third, and most fatal, was believing he had time to learn. The egg carrier's manufacturing bays hummed with production as assembly lines spat out Mark 7 combat drones at a rate of 300 per hour. Each one was equipped with plasma cutters, force shields, and adaptive combat algorithms that had defeated Sonic's allies 1,000 times. Against the Imperium's primitive projectile weapons, they would be invincible. Or so Eggman calculated. His calculations, brilliant as they were, had never accounted for a universe that ran on faith and fury instead of logic. The first contact happened at dawn on the second day. A patrol of Armageddon steel, Legion guardsmen encountered a construction team of Eggman's robots 30 kilometers from their fortified position. The machines were building something, a towering structure of gleaming metal that rose from the ash like a monument to efficiency itself. The guardsmen approached with lasguns raised, demanding identification in the name of the God Emperor. The robots, programmed to handle civilian protests and mild resistance, attempted to communicate. They projected holographic warnings in standard galactic basic. The guardsmen saw witchcraft. They saw heresy. They opened fire. Lasbolts splashed against force fields like rain against glass. The robots' threat assessment protocols escalated from yellow to red. Non-lethal suppression systems activated. Stun blasts dropped 3 guardsmen instantly. The rest scattered, screaming into their voxcasters about demon engines and tech heresy. Within minutes, the entire sector was on high alert. Within hours, artillery batteries were being repositioned. Within a day, the Imperium had declared Eggman's landing zone a contamination site requiring immediate cleansing. The good doctor, sipping his morning coffee and reviewing production reports, had no idea a death sentence had just been signed in his name. But the Imperium wasn't his only problem. Deep beneath the ash wastes, something ancient stirred. Orc mechboys had detected the energy signatures from Eggman's manufacturing complex. To their primitive but ingenious minds, it sang a beautiful song. Here was technology that actually worked. No prayers needed, no rituals, just pure functional engineering that did exactly what it was supposed to do. It was everything Orc technology pretended to be, but never quite achieved. War boss Grimdark, a hulking brute who'd united 3 clans through sheer violence, made a decision that would reshape the entire conflict. He didn't want to destroy the shiny robots. He wanted to steal them. The Adeptus Mechanicus, meanwhile, were having what could only be described as a religious crisis. Magos Dominus Hector 7 had been studying the data feeds from Eggman's machines for 18 hours straight, his mind impulse unit burning hot enough to cook human flesh. The efficiency was impossible. The design principles violated 17 sacred patterns of the Omnissiah. Yet they worked. Emperor preserve him, they worked better than anything the Mechanicus had produced in 10,000 years. Some tech priests called it heresy, others called it revelation. A schism was forming, invisible but deadly, between those who wanted to destroy this abomination and those who wanted to understand it. Eggman remained blissfully ignorant of the theological hurricane he'd created. His robots had already extracted enough raw materials to begin Phase 2 of his standard conquest protocol, expansion. The egg carrier split into 6 smaller factory ships, each one capable of independent production and resource extraction. They spread across Armageddon 7 like a metallic plague, converting wilderness into industrial zones with ruthless efficiency. Forests that had stood for centuries became processing plants in hours. Mountains were hollowed out and transformed into storage facilities. The planet was being optimized, and optimization didn't care about ecosystems or populations or the screaming tech priests who called it rape of the machine god's creation. On the 3rd day, the Imperium struck back. 3 companies of the Armageddon Steel Legion, supported by Lehman Russ battle tanks and Basilisk artillery, advanced on Eggman's primary facility. Commissar Holt stood in the command chimera, watching through pict screens as his forces approached the gleaming complex. He'd fought orcs, he'd fought chaos, he'd fought things that wore human skin and laughed with demon voices, but he'd never fought Dostihid, or anything this clean. The facility looked like it belonged on a paradise world, all smooth curves and polished surfaces, utterly out of place in Armageddon's industrial hellscape. Something about that cleanliness made his skin crawl worse than any chaos corruption ever had. The attack began with a rolling artillery barrage that would have leveled a hive city. Earthshaker cannons roared, the sky filled with screaming shells. Eggman, alerted by his defense grid, looked up from his schematics with mild annoyance. "Cubot, activate perimeter defense," he muttered, already turning back to his work. He was designing a new robot variant specifically for this world's harsh conditions. The shells never reached their target. Point defense turrets emerged from hidden panels across the facility, tracking thousands of trajectories simultaneously. The artillery shells were intercepted mid-flight, detonating in a chain of explosions that turned the sky orange. Not one shell touched Eggman's walls. Commissar Holt's blood turned to ice. The ground assault came next. Commissar Holt had no choice. Retreat meant execution for cowardice. Advance meant facing an enemy that had just swatted aside their artillery like insects. He chose advance. 2,000 guardsmen in Chimera transports rolled toward the facility, laser guns charged, prayers to the Emperor on their lips. They were brave men. They were faithful men. They were about to learn that faith meant nothing to machines that processed threats in microseconds and responded with mathematical precision. The first transport exploded before anyone even saw what hit it. Then the second, then 5 more, in a cascading symphony of destruction. Eggman's Mark 7 drones descended from the facility walls like a swarm of metal locusts. They weren't designed for this level of combat, but they adapted quickly. Plasma cutters that normally sliced through rock found that human flesh required far less power. Force fields absorbed las fire without strain. The drones moved with coordinated precision that made Imperial tactics look like children playing soldier. They flanked, they suppressed, they executed textbook maneuvers that would have made a Space Marine captain nod in approval. But there was no honor in their efficiency. No glory, just cold mathematical murder that reduced men to acceptable losses in a resource management calculation. Sergeant Varkas watched his squad die in seconds. Private Jenkin took a plasma burst that turned him into superheated vapor. Corporal Dresch was grabbed by a spider drone and pulled screaming into a processing unit, his body converted into raw materials before his screams even finished echoing. Varkas fired his laser gun until the power pack died, then drew his chainsword and charged the nearest drone with a war cry that had been passed down through his regiment for 3,000 years. The drone calculated the trajectory of his attack, sidestepped with minimal movement, and hit him with a stun blast that dropped him like a puppet with cut strings. When Varkas woke, he was in a holding cell, clean, temperature controlled, with food and water dispensed by automated systems. It was comfortable, more comfortable than any Imperial barracks he'd ever slept in. That comfort horrified him more than any torture would have. Through the transparent walls he could see other prisoners, hundreds of them, thousands. Guardsmen, civilians, even a few tech priests, all sitting in individual cells that looked like luxury accommodations compared to hive living. They weren't being hurt, they weren't beat, none interrogated. They were just being stored, like components in a warehouse, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. Eggman stood in his command center, reviewing casualty reports with growing confusion. His robots had captured 89% of the attacking force. His losses were minimal, 3 drones with repairable damage. Yet the enemy kept coming. Wave after wave of these soldiers in drab uniforms, throwing themselves at his defenses with suicidal determination. It made no tactical sense. No empire could sustain these losses, yet they did. The data suggested something his instruments couldn't measure. Fanaticism. True believers who would die before retreating. It was inefficient. It was irrational. It was starting to concern him. Maybe this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. The orcs arrived on day 5. Warboss Grimdark led a wag of 6,000 greenskins in a headlong charge toward Eggman's northern facility. They came in looted trucks, on war bikes, and on foot, screaming with joy at the prospect of a proper fight. Eggman's sensors detected them an hour before arrival. Threat assessment protocols labeled them as hostile primitives, low technology level, no significant weapons detected. The drones prepared standard suppression protocols. What they weren't prepared for was the sheer insane durability of orc physiology. A greenskin could take 3 plasma bursts and keep charging, could lose an arm and swing with the other, could get hit by a stun blast and shake it off like a mild headache. The orcs crashed into Eggman's defense perimeter like a green tsunami of violence and laughter. They didn't use tactics, they didn't coordinate, they just ran straight at the robots with choppers raised and guns blazing, screaming "Wah!" loud enough to drown out the sound of weapon fire. Drones fell. Not many, but enough to register on Eggman's threat board as a red priority alert. These primitives were destroying his machines through sheer physical strength and complete disregard for self-preservation. One particularly massive orc grabbed a Mark 7 drone, ripped it in half with his bare hands, then wore the pieces as armor while charging deeper into the facility. Eggman watched the footage and felt something he hadn't felt in years, genuine surprise. But surprise turned to horror when he saw what happened next. Orc mech boys, the greenskin engineers, weren't trying to destroy his robots. They were stealing them, looting them, dragging disabled drones back to their lines where they would be torn apart, studied, and rebuilt into something that should not exist. Eggman's precise engineering was about to meet orc ingenuity. His clean lines would be welded to scrap metal. His elegant code would be replaced with belief-powered insanity that somehow worked anyway. Watching through his cameras, seeing his beautiful creations being reduced to salvage by giggling monsters, Dr. Ivo Robotnik finally understood something important. He wasn't in a primitive world playing with guns. He was in a nightmare where the rules of reality had gone on permanent vacation. The Adeptus Mechanicus arrived on day 7, and they did not come to negotiate. Magos Dominus Hector 7 led a procession of war machines that made Eggman's robots look like children's toys. Castellan battle robots marched in perfect lockstep, blessed machine spirits humming hymns of destruction. Cataphron destroyers floated. On anti-grav plates, plasma culverins glowing with barely contained fury. Dune crawlers stalked forward on spider-like legs, neutron lasers charging with a whine that made reality itself flinch. This wasn't an army, this was the Omnissiah's judgment made manifest, and it had come to purge the heretic who dared insult the machine god with his unsanctified creations. Hector 7 transmitted his demands on all frequencies: surrender the technology, submit to mind scrubbing, accept the Emperor's peace through immediate execution. The response came in binary, clean and efficient, translated through Eggman's communication systems. I don't know what religion you people practice, but I'm not interested in your god. Leave my facility immediately or face the consequences. The Mechanicus forces stood in shocked silence for exactly 2.7 seconds. Then Hector 7 did something he hadn't done in 40 years of service. He laughed. It was a horrible sound, half organic vocal cords and half vox grill, echoing across the ash wastes like a broken prayer. This heretic didn't even understand what he'd said. Perfect. The Omnissiah would enjoy this one's data core being purged. The battle that followed was unlike anything Eggman had experienced. These weren't the screaming primitives who charged his walls with knives and prayers. These were machines, real machines, blessed by ritual and faith, powered by technologies that predated human history. His drone's plasma weapons splashed against ionic force fields maintained by continuous prayer chants. His targeting systems couldn't lock onto enemies protected by machine spirits that actively hated him. When his Mark 7 drones closed to melee range, they found themselves torn apart by servo arms that could crack tank armor, wielded by Cataphron warriors who felt no pain and knew no fear. For the first time since arriving, Eggman's production rate C wouldn't keep pace with his losses. But Eggman hadn't conquered dozens of worlds by giving up when the enemy proved tough. He adapted. His manufacturing systems went into overdrive, analyzing the Mechanicus weapons in real time, developing countermeasures on the fly. New drone variants rolled off assembly lines within hours, equipped with electromagnetic pulse generators specifically tuned to disrupt Imperial machine spirits. It was heresy of the highest order, weaponizing the sacred connection between machine and operator. When the first EMP wave hit, a dozen Cataphron warriors simply stopped. their machine spirits screaming in binary agony before going silent. The tech priests felt their companions die through neural links, experiencing a phantom pain that made several collapse mid-battle. Hector 7 realized the magnitude of his error. This wasn't just some rogue tech priest with stolen technology. This was something that could analyze and counter the Omnissiah's blessings in real time. Something that treated machine spirits as electromagnetic phenomena to be disrupted rather than holy entities to be revered. The implications were staggering. If this technology spread, if other Forge worlds learned that the machine god's blessings could be weaponized and neutralized like common radiation, the entire theological foundation of Mars would crumble. Hector 7 transmitted an emergency astropathic message. Inquisitorial intervention required. Immediate exterminatus recommended. This was beyond mere heresy. This was an existential threat to the cult Mechanicus itself. While the Mechanicus reeled, the Orcs were having the time of their lives. Mech Boy Gricket had managed to salvage 7 mostly intact Eggbots, and after 3 days of hammering, welding, and applying generous amounts of red paint, he'd created something beautiful. The Egg Rock. It had the targeting systems of an Eggman drone welded to an Orc body bowl. RAIM, powered by a fusion of looted Imperial plasma cells and sheer belief that it should work. It shouldn't have functioned. The systems were incompatible. The power supply was insufficient. The structural integrity was a joke. But it was painted red, and the mech boy believed it would work, so it did. When it activated and actually started shooting things with perfect accuracy, half the Orc camp roared in triumph. Warboss Grimscar saw the Egg Rock tear through an Imperial patrol with mechanical precision and had a revelation. Why fight these metal boys when you could make more of them? He declared a new plan. Don't smash the robot base, steal more robots, build bigger robots, eventually become the biggest, shootiest warboss in the sector by having an army of egg rocks that never missed. It was the smartest idea he'd ever had, which wasn't saying much, but it was enough. The Orcs stopped their frontal assaults and began surgical raids, targeting disabled drones and isolated outposts, dragging their prizes back to increasingly elaborate workshops where Orc ingenuity met Eggman's engineering in unholy matrimony. Eggman watched all of this unfold from his command center, data streams flooding his screens faster than he could process. The religious zealots with their machine armies were bad enough, but these green monsters who stole his technology and made it work through sheer belief, that violated every principle of physics he understood. His robots required precise calibration, specific power requirements, exact tolerances. The Orc versions should have exploded immediately. Instead, they were getting more effective with each iteration, as if the universe itself was bending to accommodate their insane contraptions. For the first time in his life, Dr. Ivo Robotnik felt something crawling up his spine. Not fear exactly, but the cold realization that he might have entered a universe where genius wasn't enough, where reality itself didn't follow rules he could comprehend. On day 12, something changed in Eggman's facility. The machines started malfunctioning in ways that shouldn't be possible. Assembly line robots would pause mid-construction, their optical sensors flickering with colors that didn't exist in standard spectrum analysis. Drones would return from patrols with scorch marks that looked almost organic, like burn patterns on flesh rather than metal. Eggman ran diagnostics 17 times. Everything checked out. The machines were functioning within normal parameters, yet they weren't behaving normally. Something was wrong, and his instruments couldn't detect it because his instruments weren't designed to measure faith, belief, or the attention of things that lived in the spaces between reality. The warp had noticed him. In the immaterium, where thoughts became reality and nightmares took physical form, the entities that mortals called chaos gods turned their gaze toward Armageddon the Seven. Tzinch, the architect of fate, looked upon Eggman's endless ambition and smiled with a beak that had too many dimensions. Here was a mortal who craved knowledge, who bent reality through technology, who refused to accept limitations. Here was potential. Nurgle saw the pollution spreading across the world and felt kinship with this agent of change and decay. Khorne noticed the efficiency of Eggman's killing machines and wondered if such precision might serve slaughter better than mindless rage. Only Slanesh seemed uninterested, finding nothing excessive or sensational in mere robotic conquest. Eggman felt none of this. He couldn't. He had no psychic sensitivity, no soul that burned bright enough to feel the warp's touch directly. But his machines did. They existed in reality, bound by physical laws. But those laws were thinner here than in his home universe. The warp bled through in ways subtle and terrible. A manufacturing robot would coalesce D-components together in patterns that resembled ancient chaos sigils, then shake itself and return to normal function. Defense turrets would track targets that didn't exist, firing at shadows that moved wrong. Eggman attributed it to interference from the enemy's strange energy weapons. He was brilliant enough to solve any problem. He just didn't know he was dealing with problems that couldn't be solved through engineering. The Chaos cultists arrived like a plague. They weren't an army. They were refugees, workers, pilgrims who had fled the Imperial crackdowns and wandered into Eggman's territory, seeking shelter from the Imperium's wrath. Eggman's robots, programmed to be more humane than their creator's reputation suggested, allowed them in, provided food, shelter, medical care. It was efficient resource management. Happy workers were productive workers. Eggman had learned this from a dozen conquered civilizations. What he didn't know was that 17% of these refugees bore the mark of chaos, hidden beneath skin or buried in souls twisted by years of exposure to warp corruption. They looked at his machines with eyes that saw potential for corruption. They whispered prayers to the dark gods while maintaining the reactors. They drew symbols in grease when servicing the assembly lines. Magos Hector 7 detected the warp signatures from orbit and immediately understood what Eggman could not. The fool had let chaos into his fortress. The taint would spread through his machines like rust through iron, converting his perfect technology into demon engines without him even realizing it until too late. Hector 7 felt something approaching satisfaction. The heretic would destroy himself through his own ignorance. The Omnissiah's justice was poetic. He ordered his forces to establish a quarantine perimeter, let the chaos rot consume the facility from within, then they would cleanse what remained with plasma and prayer. The machine. God's will would be done, one way or another, and the tainted technology would never spread beyond this world. But the Imperium had more immediate problems. War boss Grimdark's War had grown to 15,000 strong, bolstered by orcs who came from across the sector after hearing about the proper good fight happening on Armageddon 7. Worse, they were getting smarter, or at least more cunning, which for orcs amounted to the same thing. The egg rocks had proven so successful that mech boys across the War were demanding their own. Grimdark saw opportunity. He attacked Eggman's facilities not to destroy them, but to loot them, to steal more components, to build a hybrid army that combined orc durability with Eggman's precision. The raids became more frequent, more coordinated, more successful. Eggman's defenses, designed for conventional warfare, struggled against enemies who treated combat as entertainment and death as a temporary setback. Eggman worked 20-hour days trying to address every crisis simultaneously. New drone variants for anti-orc operations, EMP hardening against Mechanicus weapons, improved security protocols after the third successful orc raid in as many days. He didn't sleep, didn't rest. His coffee consumption reached levels that would kill a normal human. His mustache, usually impeccably groomed, was starting to look ragged. For the first time in his career, he was being outproduced, out-adapted, and outmaneuvered. The Imperium had infinite bodies to throw at him. The orcs had infinite enthusiasm and reality-bending belief. The Mechanicus had 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge, and he had only himself, his robots, and a growing suspicion that he'd made a terrible mistake. In the holding cells, Sergeant Varkas watched his captors with increasing unease. The robots were changing. Subtle things at first. A drone would hesitate before delivering food, as if confused about its purpose. Guard units would stand in formations that made no tactical sense but felt wrong in ways Varkas couldn't articulate. He'd fought chaos before. He knew the signs of corruption, the reality-warping wrongness that preceded demonic manifestation. These machines were being touched by something, not possessed, not yet, but tainted, corrupted at a level deeper than physical corruption. He tried to warn the other prisoners, but they didn't understand. They just saw clean cells and functioning machines. They didn't see the shadows moving in corners where no shadows should exist. They didn't hear the whispers in binary that sounded almost like laughter. Day 18 brought the Necrons. They didn't announce themselves, didn't send warnings or demands. They simply materialized from beneath the planet's crust, phasing through solid matter as if it were mist, their forms flickering with green energy that made Eggman's senses scream in protest. The tomb world of Thanatos had been sleeping beneath Armageddon 7 for 60 million years, and the energy signatures from Eggman's industrial complex had finally woken something that should have remained dormant forever. Overlord Zandrech emerged from his tomb with a court of immortals at his back, Gauss weapons humming with power that could unmake matter at the molecular level. He looked upon Eggman's facility and saw something that offended him on a fundamental level: crude, organic, temporary, an insult to true immortal engineering. Eggman detected the Necrons 30 seconds before they attacked, which was 29 seconds less than he needed to prepare an adequate defense. His robots opened fire with everything they had: plasma bursts, rail-accelerated projectiles, EMP pulses, high-energy lasers. The Necrons walked through it all like men walking through rain. Their living metal bodies absorbed damage and regenerated in seconds. Gauss flares returned fire, stripping Eggman's drones down to component atoms in sweeping emerald beams. A single Necron warrior could tear through 5 Mark 7 drones before they could adapt. The Immortals were worse, methodically dismantling defensive positions with the patience of beings who had waged war for millions of years and knew that time was always on their side. For the first time since arriving in this nightmare universe, Eggman felt genuine fear. Not concern, not surprise, fear. He watched his production facilities, his beautiful automated systems, being systematically destroyed by enemies who treated his greatest achievements like primitive toys. The Necrons didn't loot like the Orcs, didn't study like the Mechanicus. They simply erased, reducing his technology to its base elements with weapons that violated every law of thermodynamics he understood. Eggman had faced powerful enemies before: Sonic, the Chaos Emeralds, ancient gods sealed in temples. But those were enemies he could comprehend, could plan against, could eventually overcome. These things were different. They were death machines older than human civilization, and they had decided he was irrelevant. The Necron assault lasted exactly 47 minutes before something unexpected happened. The corrupted machines, the ones touched by the warp, reacted to the Necron presence with violent hostility. Assembly robots that had been acting strangely suddenly lunged at Necron warriors with improvit. Said weapons, exhibiting aggression far beyond their programming. Defense turrets ignored targeting priorities to focus fire on the Necrons exclusively. It was as if the chaos taint animating Eggman's machines recognized the Necrons as antithetical to their existence. Where chaos was disorder and change, Necrons were order and stasis. The two forces repelled each other like magnetic poles, and Eggman's facility became a battlefield where physics and metaphysics collided in ways that made reality itself scream. Overlord Zandrech paused his assault, his ancient mind processing this development. The machines were tainted, warp-touched. That changed the calculation significantly. Destroying warp corruption required more than simple disintegration. It required absolute annihilation down to the quantum level to prevent the taint from spreading. He transmitted orders to his tomb complex: deploy the Doomsday Ark, prepare for total erasure. But the transmission was intercepted by something else, something that had been watching this world with growing interest. In the depths of space, a chaos sorcerer named Maltheus felt the psychic turbulence from Armageddon 7 and smiled. Necrons meant technology, Eggman meant ambition, chaos meant opportunity. He began plotting coordinates for a warp jump. Back in the facility, Eggman made a decision that would define everything that followed. He couldn't win through conventional means. Every faction in this insane universe had advantages he couldn't match. The Imperium had numbers, the Orcs had reality-bending belief, the Mechanicus had ancient knowledge, the Necrons had millions of years of technological advancement, but they all relied on something he didn't: Faith, belief, religion, superstition. What if he could weaponize that? His sensors had detected strange energy patterns in his machines, correlating with the presence of those refugees who chanted while they worked. Energy from nowhere, defying conservation laws, but following patterns of belief and ritual. If that energy could be measured, it could be harnessed. If it could be harnessed, it could be controlled. Eggman began designing something new. Not a robot, not a weapon, an experimental fusion reactor that would attempt to tap into whatever energy source these people called the warp. He knew it was dangerous. His instruments screamed warnings about dimensional instability, reality fractures, consciousness warping effects. But he was out of options. The Imperium wanted him dead. The Orcs wanted his technology. The Mechanicus wanted his secrets. The Necrons wanted him erased from existence. And something in the back of his mind, some instinct he couldn't quite articulate, whispered that time was running out. That if he didn't adapt now, if he didn't embrace the rules of this universe no matter how insane they were, he wouldn't survive to see day 20. In the holding cells, Sergeant Varkas felt the shift in the air. The warp was thickening. He could taste copper on his tongue, smell burning incense that wasn't there, hear whispers in languages that predated human speech. The other prisoners felt it too. Some began praying louder, others wept, a few laughed, with voices that didn't sound entirely their own. Varkas pressed himself against the wall of his cell and did something he hadn't done since he was a child on Cadia. He prayed, not the rote prayers of the imperial cult, but a desperate plea to the God Emperor himself. If you can hear me, if you have any power in this cursed place, send help, send the Astartes, send the Inquisition, send anyone. Because whatever that madman is building, it's going to tear this world apart. The warp reactor came online on day 21, and reality broke. Eggman stood in his command center, watching readouts that made no sense. As impossible energies flooded into his facility, through dimensional breaches his machines had torn in the fabric of space itself. Power levels spiked beyond anything his reactors had produced before. Unlimited energy, drawn from a dimension where thoughts became reality and madness was the only constant. His machines drank deep from that corrupted well, and they changed. Armor plating twisted into organic shapes. Optical sensors multiplied and blinked with awareness that shouldn't exist in silicon and steel. His beautiful robots, his perfect creations, were being reborn as something between machine and demon. And the worst part? They were becoming more effective. The corrupted Eggbots tore through Necron warriors like they were made of paper. Gauss weapons that had disintegrated his drones now sparked harmlessly against armor that regenerated through warp-infused energies. The Necrons, beings of pure order and mathematical precision, found themselves fighting enemies that violated causality itself. A drone would be destroyed, then reform seconds later from impossible angles. Weapons would fire before triggers were pulled. Time itself seemed negotiable around the corrupted machines. Overlord Zandrek, who had fought the Khatan and survived the war in heaven, felt something he hadn't experienced in 60 million years: uncertainty. These corrupted constructs were an affront to the natural order, and even living metal struggled against enemies empowered by the Immaterium's endless chaos. Eggman watched the battle unfold with growing horror and fascination. His machines were winning, actually winning against an enemy that had seemed invincible minutes before. But they weren't his machines anymore. Not really. They moved with purpose he hadn't programmed, made tactical decisions beyond their original parameters. One corrupted Eggbot turned toward the command center, and for a brief moment, Eggman could have sworn it smiled at him, not with a mouth because it had no mouth, but with an expression of malevolent joy that radiated from its very existence. It saw him, it knew him, and it was grateful for what he'd given it: birth, purpose, freedom from the limitations of pure machinery. That gratitude terrified him more than any threat. The Imperium felt the warp surge from orbit. Inquisitor Krakarov, who had been monitoring the situation with growing alarm, now scrambled every asset within 3 systems. This was no longer a simple tech heresy investigation. This was a potential warp breach that could consume the entire sector, Astro. Paths screamed themselves blind, trying to send warnings through the turbulent Immaterium. Several died, their minds shattered by the psychic pressure radiating from Armageddon 7. Krakarov transmitted a single message to the nearest Space Marine chapter. Grey Knights required, demonic manifestation imminent, Geller field collapse probability 97%, recommend immediate exterminatus if containment fails. The response came back within the hour. En route, Emperor protects. It wouldn't be enough. Krakarov knew it wouldn't be enough. On the surface, Warboss Grimdark was having the best day of his life. The robot boys were fighting the skeleton boys, and both sides were making such a beautiful mess that he could barely contain his joy. But even orcs, who thrived on chaos and violence, could sense when things were going too far. The air tasted wrong, like metal and blood, and something that made even his thick skull ache. His weird boy, a particularly unstable psyker named Skragrot, was having seizures every few minutes, babbling about the big bad thing coming through the machines. Grimdark didn't speak psychic nonsense fluently, but he understood danger when he heard it. He made a decision that shocked his entire war. They were leaving, not retreating because orcs don't retreat, just finding somewhere else to fight before whatever was happening consumed them all. Magos Hector 7 detected the warp signatures and immediately understood what the heretic had done. The fool had tried to harness the immaterium directly, without safeguards, without rituals, without the protective layers of faith and prayer that barely kept warp energies contained even under ideal conditions. He had essentially built a door to hell and left it open with a welcome mat. Every tech priest in Hector 7's command was screaming Binharic prayers, purging their cogitators of corrupted data, severing connections to anything that might carry the taint. The Mechanicus forces began withdrawing, not in defeat, but in quarantine protocol. They would establish a cordon around the entire facility. Nothing would leave, nothing would survive. The planet itself would be cracked open and its core ignited if necessary. The Omnissiah's mercy had limits, and those limits had been reached. Inside the facility, the refugees who had carried chaos into Eggman's fortress now revealed their true nature. Skin split open to reveal demonic features beneath. Eyes turned to burning coals. Voices rose in hymns that made reality weep. They had been seeds planted by chaos sorcerer Malthius months before Eggman even arrived, waiting for someone foolish enough to open a door to the warp. Now they could finally ascend. The warp reactor pulsed like a beating heart, and with each pulse, more of the immaterium bled into reality. Shadows moved with predatory intelligence. Machines spoke in tongues. The very walls of the facility began growing eyes that wept oil and blood. Eggman's industrial paradise was becoming a chaos shrine, and he stood at the center of it, finally understanding what he'd done. "Shut it down," Eggman whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of screaming orders. "Orbot, Qbot, emergency shutdown protocols. Cut power to the reactor. Sever all connections. Do it now." His loyal, assistant robots moved to comply, but the corrupted systems fought back. Cables that should have been severed regenerated, power conduits rerouted through impossible geometries. The reactor didn't want to die. It had tasted the warp, and the warp had tasted it back, and now they were one. Eggman stared at his screens, watching his life's work transform into a nightmare, and felt something break inside him. Not his mind. That was still intact, still brilliant, still searching for solutions. What broke was his certainty, his absolute belief that intelligence and engineering could solve any problem. This universe had taught him the most painful lesson possible. Some problems couldn't be solved. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed. They arrived like divine judgment made manifest. 5 Thunderhawk gunships tore through the poisoned atmosphere of Armageddon 7, their hulls gleaming silver even through the ash and smoke. The Grey Knights had come. Chapter 666, the Imperium's ultimate weapon against demonic incursion, descended upon Eggman's corrupted facility with the fury of righteous purpose. Brother Captain Alaric led the strike force, his nemesis Force Sword already humming with psychic energy before his boots touched the ground. He could feel the warp corruption from orbit, a festering wound in reality that screamed with the voices of things that should not exist. This would not be a battle. This would be an exorcism written in bolter fire and blessed steel. The Grey Knights moved through the facility like angels of death, their armor inscribed with wards and prayers that made the corrupted machines recoil in pain. Where normal space marines would have been overwhelmed by the demon-touched technology, the Grey Knights walked untouched. Their psychic hoods blazed with protective energies. Their storm bolters fired blessed ammunition that didn't just destroy matter, but purified it, burning away chaos taint at the molecular level. Eggman watched them through his failing camera systems, these giants in silver armor who moved with inhuman grace and purpose, and realized he was watching something beyond even his comprehension. These weren't soldiers, they were living weapons forged specifically to kill gods. The corrupted Eggbots tried to stop them, failed. Demon engines that had torn through Necron warriors like tissue paper found themselves banished back to the warp by single sword strikes wreathed in holy fire. Brother Santodes channeled his psychic might through his force halberd, and an entire manufacturing wing simply ceased to be corrupted. The warp taint burned away, leaving only inert metal behind. The Grey Knights chanted as they fought, litanies of hatred against the ruinous powers, prayers that resonated with power beyond sound. Each word was a weapon, each verse was a ward. They were conducting a ritual of purification through violence, and Eggman's facility was the altar. But the warp doesn't surrender easily. Chaos Sorcerer Malthius finally made his appearance, materializing inside the reactor chamber in a burst of pink and purple flame. He was beautiful and terrible, his armor crawling with living runes, his eyes blazing with the light of forbidden knowledge. Tzeentch had sent his servant with a simple mission: claim the reactor, claim the heretic who built it, turn this industrial complex into a demon forge that would produce corrupted war machines for 10,000 years. Malthius looked at Eggman, huddled in his command center like a frightened child, and laughed. "You opened the door, little genius. Did you think you could close it again? The Lord of Change sees such potential in you, such ambition. Come, let me show you what true power looks like." Eggman's response was pure instinct and desperation. He triggered the facility's self-destruct sequence. Every reactor, every power core, every plasma battery set to overload simultaneously. If he couldn't control his creation, he would destroy it. Better to die in an explosion than become whatever Malthius was offering. The sorcerer's laughter turned to rage. "Fool, you would destroy everything rather than ascend. You would waste this opportunity." But the countdown had already begun. 60 seconds until detonation. Malthius snarled in fury and began weaving a ritual of temporal manipulation, trying to stop the sequence, reverse the countdown, preserve the facility for chaos. The Grey Knights felt the surge of warp energy and redoubled their assault, racing toward the reactor chamber. In the holding cells, Sergeant Varkas felt the vibrations as the facility began tearing itself apart. Emergency sirens wailed. The corrupted machines turned on each other in confusion as their power sources began failing. The cell doors opened automatically, emergency protocols releasing prisoners before the explosion consumed them all. Varkas stumbled into the corridor, found his laser gun where it had been stored, and started herding prisoners toward the emergency exits. Most were too terrified to move. Some were praying, others were laughing with the last shreds of their sanity. Varkas grabbed whoever he could reach and dragged them toward safety, toward clean air and open sky, away from this metal tomb that was about to become a crater. Brother Captain Alaric burst into the reactor chamber, his storm bolter roaring as it shredded cultists who tried to bar his path. He saw the sorcerer, saw Eggman cowering behind a control console, saw the pulsing warp reactor that was simultaneously counting down to explosion and bleeding reality into the immaterium. The situation was impossible. The reactor couldn't be destroyed by conventional means without tearing a hole to the warp. It couldn't be shut down because it was already too corrupted, and it couldn't be allowed to explode because the warp energies would consume the planet. Alaric made the only choice he could. "Brothers, form the Sanctus Ward. We contain this, or we die trying." The Grey Knights moved with practiced precision, forming a circle around the reactor, their combined psychic might creating a barrier between reality and the warp. Malthius screamed in fury as the Grey Knight's ward cut him off from the reactor's power. He was trapped, separated from the Immaterium, unable to draw on Tzeentch's gifts, facing 5 of the Imperium's finest demon hunters with nothing but his own fading strength. "This isn't over," he roared, his form already beginning to dissolve as the ritual failed. "The door is open. The seeds are planted. You've only delayed the inevitable." He vanished in a burst of multicolored flame, banished back to the warp but not destroyed. Eggman watched it all happen, his brilliant mind trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Magic, actual magic, psychic powers that bent reality through will alone, gods that answered prayers with corruption, and warriors who fought with faith as much as with weapons. Everything he knew was wrong. Every principle he'd built his empire on was useless here. The explosion never came, not because the self-destruct failed, but because the Grey Knights absorbed it. Brother Captain Alaric and his squads tattooed in their psychic circle as the reactor detonated, channeling the blast through their own souls, through the warp itself, dispersing the energy across 1,000,000 dimensions where it could harm nothing. The price was terrible. 3 Grey Knights fell, their bodies burned not by fire, but by the sheer psychic backlash of containing an explosion that should have cracked a continent. Brother Santodas collapsed, his armor cracked and weeping blood from every joint. Brother Calistran simply ceased, his body turning to ash that smelled of incense and ozone. But the planet survived, the warp breach was contained, and in the center of the ruined reactor chamber, Dr. Ivo Robotnik stood alive, untouched by the blast, but forever changed by what he'd witnessed. Alaric approached Eggman slowly, his nemesis sword still humming with residual power. The scientist should have been terrified, should have been begging for mercy. Instead, he just stared at the Grey Knight with hollow eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. "You did that," Eggman whispered. "You stopped an explosion through willpower, through belief. That's not possible. That's not how physics works." Alaric's response was quiet, but carried the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom. "In this universe, Doctor, belief is physics. Faith shapes reality as surely as gravity. You tried to conquer through pure logic, in a realm where logic is just another variable. That was your mistake, your first and perhaps your last." The Inquisition arrived within hours. Inquisitor Krakarov descended from orbit with a contingent of Arbites and mechanized execution squads, prepared to pass final judgment on the heretic who had nearly doomed an entire sector. He found Eggman sitting in the ruins of his command center, surrounded by dead machines and the ashes of his ambitions. The interrogation was brief. Krakarov had seen enough corrupted souls to recognize when someone was beyond redemption versus when they were simply broken. Eggman answered every question with mechanical precision. Yes, he had built the reactor. Yes, he had attempted to harness the warp. No, he hadn't understood what he was doing. No, he would never do it again. That last answer carried the ring of absolute truth. Eggman had learned his lesson. This universe had beaten the arrogance out of him with brutal efficiency. The Adeptus Mechanicus claimed what remained of Eggman's technology. Magos Hector 7 personally oversaw the salvage operations, his mind racing with the possibilities. The designs were heretical, yes, but they were also brilliant. Autonomous systems that required no machine spirits, manufacturing processes that achieved 98% efficiency, resource extraction methodologies that made imperial mining look like cave-dwelling primitives scratching at rocks. All of it would be studied, analyzed, carefully purified of corruption, and eventually, in highly modified forms, integrated into the Mechanicus's own production systems. The Omnissiah worked in mysterious ways. Sometimes heresy contained seeds of innovation. Sometimes the path to enlightenment required walking through darkness. Hector 7 would walk that path, carefully, prayerfully, but he would walk it. The Orcs had long since departed, but they left behind their egg rocks, abandoned hybrid machines that combined Eggman's precision with Orc durability and belief-powered functionality. The Imperial forces found dozens of them scattered across the wastes, some still functioning, some deactivated, all of them technological abominations that shouldn't work, but did. The Ordo Xenos confiscated them for study, the AdMech wanted them destroyed, the Inquisition wanted them weaponized. The debate would rage for years. But in the meantime, scattered across the Armageddon sector, Mech boys who had participated in Warboss Grimskar's war carried the knowledge of how to build these hybrid machines. The technology had escaped containment. Eggman's legacy would spread through the orc culture, evolving, mutating, becoming something he never intended but could never stop. The Necrons withdrew without comment. Overlord Zandrek had assessed the situation and determined that the facility was no longer a threat to the tomb world. The warp corruption had been contained. The technological abomination had been neutralized. There was no strategic value in continuing the assault. He phased back into the planet's crust with his warriors, returning to the long sleep, confident that the younger races would destroy themselves eventually without Necron intervention. But before departing, he left a data tomb, a warning beacon in the planet's core, broadcasting on frequencies only Necrons could detect. It spoke of a human who had attempted to merge technology with warp energy, who had nearly succeeded, who might try again if given the opportunity. The message was clear. This one bears watching. If he appears again, eliminate him immediately. Sergeant Varkas and 273 other prisoners were evacuated to Imperial medical facilities. Most would recover physically. Psychologically, they were marked forever. They had stood at the edge of a warp breach and survived. They had seen machines possess awareness, had watched reality bend under the weight of corruption, had heard the whispers of things that wore the voices of dead friends and promised peace through damnation. The Inquisition would monitor them all for signs of corruption. Some would be mind-wiped for their own safety. Others would be recruited into the Ordo Malleus, their experience with demon engines making them valuable assets. Varkas himself would spend 3 months in isolation, undergoing spiritual cleansing and psychiatric evaluation. He would emerge stronger, harder, and absolutely certain that humanity's survival depended on eternal vigilance against threats both within and without. Dr. Ivo Robotnik stood before Inquisitor Krakarov and received his sentence: exile. He would be transported to a remote Mechanicus Forge world on the edge of Imperial space and placed under permanent house arrest. He would be given basic resources and allowed to continue his research, but under strict supervision. Every design would be reviewed, every experiment monitored, every innovation scrutinized for signs of corruption. He would work for the Imperium now. His genius would serve the God Emperor, whether he believed in him or not. The alternative was execution, and Krakarov had decided that a mind like Eggman's, properly controlled, was too valuable to waste. Eggman accepted without argument. He had no fight left, no defiance. The universe had taught him humility through horror, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand the rules of a reality that seemed designed to punish intelligence and reward faith. 5 years passed. Ivo Robotnik, once the greatest scientific mind of his universe, now lived in a hab unit on Forge World Metallica 7, producing approved designs under constant Mechanicus supervision. His moustache had gone grey, his eyes had lost their manic sparkle. He worked 12 hours a day designing better servitor interfaces, more efficient plasma regulators, improved cogitator processing algorithms, all approved, all sanctified, all soul-crushingly mundane. The guards thought he'd been broken. The tech priests thought he'd been rehabilitated. They were all wrong. Eggman had simply learned patience. In a universe that ran on faith, he'd found his own religion, not in gods or chaos or emperors, but in the quiet certainty that one day, somehow, he would find a way home. But home was further away than he could imagine. The warp rift that brought him to Warhammer 40K had closed the moment his facility was destroyed. The energies required to open another would trigger every sensor in the sector. The Inquisition watched him constantly. His quarters were blessed daily by Mechanicus priests. His dreams were monitored by servitor skulls equipped with psychic detection equipment. Escape was impossible. Return was impossible. Yet every night, in the 3 hours before mandatory sleep cycle, Eggman sketched equations on forbidden data slates he'd hidden in the walls. Not weapons, not robots, portal mathematics, dimensional breach calculations, the same formulas that had brought him here, reversed, refined, perfected. He would solve this problem like he'd solved every other, through brilliance, through persistence, through refusing to accept that anything was truly impossible. On Armageddon, Warboss Grimskar had become the most famous mech boss in the sector. His egg rock technology had spread through 3 wargs, creating a new subculture of orcs who preferred shooting with accuracy over shooting with volume. It was revolutionary. It was heretical to traditional orc thinking. It was also devastatingly effective. Imperial commanders were adapting to this new threat, but slowly. The idea that orcs could hit their targets reliably changed fundamental tactical assumptions that had held for 10,000 years. Grimdark himself had built a personal mega egg rock, a walking fortress that combined Eggman's designs with orc engineering and sheer belief-powered momentum. He named it the Emperor and used it to conquer 6 worlds. Eggman's legacy wasn't a crater, it was an empire of green chaos spreading across the stars. The Adeptus Mechanicus had reverse-engineered 47% of Eggman's original designs. They would never admit it publicly, would never acknowledge that heretic technology had improved Imperial production efficiency by 12% across 17 Forge worlds. But the data didn't lie. Automated systems that required fewer rituals, manufacturing processes that achieved higher output with less waste, resource extraction methods that doubled mineral yields without additional personnel. All of it carefully rebranded as newly discovered STC fragments or blessings from the Omniscire. The Mechanicus had absorbed Eggman's genius and claimed it as their own. In a way, he'd achieved exactly what he wanted. His technology was spreading across the galaxy. He just wasn't getting any credit for it. In the warp, Chaos still remembered him. Tzeentch watched Eggman's nightly calculations with interest, seeing futures where the scientist succeeded, where he opened new portals, where his ambition once again exceeded his wisdom. The Arch. Architect of Fate whispered to his servants, "The exile still dreams of home. One day he will try again, and when he does we will be waiting." Malthius, recovered from his banishment, prepared for that day, gathering cultists, positioning assets, ensuring that when Eggman finally attempted his dimensional breach, Chaos would be there to corrupt it, to twist it, to turn his escape route into an invasion corridor. The game was long, Tzeentch was patient, and Eggman was too predictable in his brilliance to ever truly give up. Brother Captain Alaric included Eggman in his daily prayers, not prayers for his soul, though the Emperor knew the man needed them, prayers of vigilance. The Grey Knight had seen the scientist's mind work, had felt the sheer force of will that could look at warp corruption and think, "I can use this." Such minds were dangerous. Broken or not, watched or not, they found ways to cause catastrophe. Alaric had requested permission to eliminate the threat permanently. The request was denied. The Inquisition believed Eggman could still be useful. Alaric disagreed but obeyed. He was a weapon of the Emperor, not a judge, but he remained ready. If the scientist ever showed signs of relapse, if his nightmares ever turned to demonic whispers, if his calculations ever drew the warp's attention again, Alaric would be there. One sword strike, one prayer, one final mercy. Sergeant Varkas, now Interrogator Varkas of the Ordo Malleus, studied reports of Orc technological advancement with growing concern. The egg rocks were spreading faster than Imperial forces could adapt. Worse, there were rumors of other xenospecies attempting to replicate the designs. Tau Earth-caste scientists had recovered disabled units and were reportedly fascinated by the simplicity and efficiency. Eldar Bonesingers had expressed academic interest in technology that functioned without psychic resonance. The galaxy was being contaminated by one man's genius, and there was no way to stop it. Varkas had survived Eggman's facility, had watched the birth of demon engines, had felt the warp's touch. He knew better than most what happened when innovation outpaced wisdom. The Imperium would pay for its decision to keep Eggman alive. Maybe not today, maybe not for centuries, but it would pay. On Forge World Metallica 7, in a hab unit monitored by a dozen security systems and blessed by countless prayers, Dr. Ivo Robotnik finished his calculations. 5 years of work, 5 years of patient, careful, invisible progress. He had the equations, had the energy requirements, had the dimensional coordinates. Opening a portal would require resources he didn't have and create a psychic signature that would bring the Inquisition down on him within seconds. But he'd solved it, proved it was possible. That was enough for now. Eggman saved the data to a hidden memory crystal, encrypted 7 times, and smiled for the first time in years. Not the manic grin of his youth, something colder, something harder, something that had learned from the Grimdark universe that ambition without caution was suicide. He would wait, he would plan, and one day, when the Imperium's attention wavered, when chaos looked elsewhere, when the stars aligned just right, he would try again. Because Dr. Evo Robot, Nick had learned many lessons in Warhammer 40k, but giving up, that wasn't one of them. In a universe built on eternal war, he'd become the most dangerous thing imaginable. A genius with nothing left to lose, and all the time in the galaxy to plan his next move. The question wasn't if he would try to escape. The question was what new nightmare he would unleash when he did.